The medieval day didn't it end with clocks, for few had them. It ended with the sun, slow and solemn in its sinking, laying down gold upon thatched roofs, turning windows into small fires, stretching shadows until they touched one another across the street. Light ebbed as water does from shore, leaving hollows in corners, a chill in the air, and a hush upon voices. Work slowed first in the fields. Scythes leaned against hedges, ploughs were dragged home, cattle herded to folds, sheep to pens. In towns, stalls closed, shutters drawn, coins counted under the last glow. The world folded itself inward, preparing for night. The bells marked the turning. From towers of stone their toll rolled through valleys and streets, a sound as old as the walls themselves. One bell for vespers, calling to prayer as the sun kissed the horizon. Another later, the curfew bell, heavy and commanding, telling all to bank their hearths, shutter their lights, and yield the town to silence. The word itself, Curfew, cover the fire, was both warning and protection, for flames were friend by day but enemy by night. Smoke curled into dusk, hearths glowed faint but hidden, and families gathered in the darkened warmth. Shutters clapped, candles were snuffed in taverns or left to burn low for those who lingered. Doors closed with the scrape of iron on wood, bolts slid into place. The lanes grew empty, their stones gleaming faintly in moonlight or swallowed wholly in shadow. Only the watch walked abroad, or those with cause healers summoned to a birth, messengers carrying urgent word, travelers caught late. The town became a shell, its life withdrawn into rooms where voices murmured low and firelight flickered behind cracks. Above it all stretched the vast sky, scattered with stars, vast enough to remind any who glanced upward how small their house truly was. In the countryside, the coming of night was gentler yet deeper. Fields lay quiet, save for the rustle of creatures stirring, owl's low call, the fox's soft tread. Farmers walked home along paths worn by generations, their dogs trotting at heel, lanterns swinging. Smoke marked each cottage where supper simmered in pots and bread was broken by weary hands. The light of day's labor gave way to the dark of rest, and though fears lingered in the black, there was also comfort, the nearness of family, the warmth of straw bed and woolen blanket, the rhythm of sleep that had guided lives since the world began. The senses shifted as night deepened. With sight diminished, sound grew sharper. The creak of beams, the sigh of wind through shutters, the call of distant dogs. Smell, too, became companion. Simmering broth, smoke from peat or oak, the sharp tang of tallow candles. Touch was relied upon, fingers finding the latch in darkness, feet knowing the path across the floor. Night trained its own ways of living, demanding care and patience. Men and women learned to move with shadows, to trust memory more than sight, to pace their lives not by the clock, but by the balance of light and dark. For some, the coming of night was feared. Spirits were thought to stir then, wandering souls or darker things that belonged to shadow. Yet for others it was welcome, a pause, a cloak that wrapped the weary. It was a tie for stories told by fire, for prayers murmured at bedside, for silence after the din of market and plough. The medieval night was not absence of life, but its other half, a rhythm as necessary as breath. And when the sun had set and the bell was hushed, the world lay down in darkness, held between fear and comfort, between mystery and rest. When the sun withdrew and shutters closed, light did not vanish altogether. It lingered in smaller flames, humble, flickering, fragile as breath. Candles and lamps were the guardians of medieval night, their glow the thin line between safety and shadow. They revealed faces around the hearth, gleamed faintly on walls, and turned a single room into an island of warmth, afloat in a sea of dark. The simplest light was the rushlight, a stalk of rush peeled and dried, dipped in tallow, then set upright in a small iron clip. It burned quickly, unevenly, hissing and guttering as fat dripped and sparks leapt. Poor households relied on such lights, for they cost little. The rushes gathered in marshes, the tallow skimmed from cooking pots or rendered from scraps. Their glow was pale, their smoke sharp, but they were better than blindness. Many a tale was told by such a flame, many a prayer whispered before it. Tallow candles came next, thicker, steadier, made from the rendered fat of sheep or oxes. They were poured or dipped again and again until they thickened into rods of pale yellow. They smoked, they smelled of grease, but they held longer than rushlights, and their flame was a comfort. A family might keep only a few, sparing them for nights when work or need pressed beyond sunset, sewing that could not wait, sickness that demanded watching, accounts that needed tallying. They were treasures in their way, carried carefully, shielded from draughts, watched lest they set straw or cloth aflame. The noblest candles were of beeswax, smooth, golden, sweet with the scent of honey. They burned clean and bright, a steady light that scarcely wavered. Such candles were costly, for bees were precious and wax rare. They glowed in churches, rising tall in great stands before altars, their flames like prayers ascending. They gleamed in the halls of lords, lighting feasts and councils. To light a beeswax candle in a humble home was to invite a taste of splendor, a mark of celebration or solemnity. Their brightness was not only useful but symbolic, a sign of purity, a light fit for God and king alike. Oil lamps, too, played their part. Simple clay bowls filled with oil, with a wick laid across, they gave a soft, steady glow. In monasteries they lined cloisters, their light guiding monks through night offices. In towns, some households kept them near hearth or altar, their flame less harsh than candles, their smoke gentler. Olive oil was dear in the north, so such lamps were rarer there, but where oil flowed more freely, they were common companions to prayer and study. Their light was ancient, carrying with it a sense of continuity, as if the flame itself had traveled from the lamps of Rome and Jerusalem. Lanterns made these flames portable, a frame of iron or wood, panels of horn or glass, a candle set within. Such a device turned flickering fire into a steady companion for the road. Horn windows glowed softly, their milky translucence blurring flame into gentle haze. Glass, rarer and clearer, revealed the flame directly, sparkling in the dark. A lantern swung from a watchman's hand as he paced streets, from a traveler's belt as he rode late, from a pilgrim's staff as he walked toward shrines. Lantern light was moving light, a promise against the unknown of night's journey. Each type of light carried its own sound and scent. The hiss of fat in a rushlight, the pop of tallow candlewick, the faint sweetness of beeswax, the quiet suck of oil as it fed a lamp. Shadows leapt and shifted with every movement, walls alive with wavering forms. Children grew drowsy watching flames dance, their lids heavy as the glow swayed. Adults bent closer to work, squinting in the dim, hands cramped but patient. Light was precious, and no flame was wasted. When candles burned low, they were pinched out with care, their stubs saved for another night. Light carried meaning beyond necessity. In churches, candles symbolized prayer, each wick a soul lifted upward. In homes, a candle at the window might guide a traveler or honor a feast. At weddings and births, lights multiplied as if to chase away the shadows of uncertainty with brightness. At deaths, candles burned by the bier, their flames standing vigil through the hours of mourning. Light was part of ritual, woven into joy and sorrow alike. Yet even with candles and lamps, night remained dim. One flame, two flames, even a dozen could not rival the sun. Rooms held pools of brightness surrounded by darkness. Corners disappeared, rafters vanished, streets outside fell into obscurity. Light in the Middle Ages was not abundance, but contrast. Narrow, tender glows against wide, patient dark. Men and women lived with shadow as constant companion, their lives half lit, their imaginations filling what their eyes could not see. And so, candles and lamps shaped the medieval night. They were guardians against fear, guides for prayer, companions for labor. They burned with fragility, easily quenched, demanding care. Yet in their small flames lay a kind of miracle, that darkness, vast and unbroken, could be pierced by something as humble as tallow, as precious as wax, as enduring as oil. In their glow, the night became livable, bearable, even beautiful. As daylight faded and the town drew inward, one sound told all that the day was truly over: the curfew bell. From the high tower of church or hall, its iron tongue struck with a slow, measured weight, each note rolling across roofs, fields, and water. It was not the hurried peal of alarm, nor the joyful clamor of feast days, but a deep, steady summons to silence. At its voice, fires were to be banked, shutters fastened, doors barred. The curfew was the hour when the living flame yielded to darkness, and the town passed from bust into guarded rest. The name itself told its purpose: Couvre-feu, cover the fire. In days when every home held open hearths of straw and timber, flame was as much danger as comfort. Left untended, it could leap to thatch, spread to beams, and turn a street into ash by morning. The bell reminded all to smother coals beneath ash, to shield embers, to draw families close to the hearth's fading glow. It was a voice of caution, born of memory of towns lost to fire, yet also of discipline, the communal breath that quieted a city at once. Children grew up with its sound. They knew the day was done when its notes reached their ears, no matter what game they played in alleys or meadows. Women finished their tasks, folding cloth, putting away tools, whispering the last prayers of the day. Men turned from taverns or workshops, hurrying home before the watch found them abroad. Even animals seemed to feel the bell's gravity. Dogs barked, then settled. Horses stamped, then grew still. Night did not fall fully until the curfew bell gave permission. Some towns struck it at different hours, earlier in winter when darkness came soon, later in summer when daylight lingered. Great cities rang from many towers at once, their sound overlapping, a chorus of iron that left no ear untouched. Small villages relied on a single bell, its note carrying over hedgerows to farms scattered in the fields. Wherever it was heard, it knit the community together, a single signal for all, noble and common, merchant and peasant alike. The curfew was law as well as custom. To be found abroad after its ringing was to risk suspicion, thief, drunkard, or worse. The watchman patrolled with lanterns and staves, ready to question those still walking. Yet exceptions remained, midwives summoned to birth, priests to dying beds, messengers on urgent errands. These figures moved like shadows in the sanctioned dark, their steps quick, their words hushed, their lanterns swaying in rhythm with the bell's memory. Not all welcomed its authority. Taverns groaned when the curfew cut short their profits. Travelers cursed when they reached the gates just as they were barred. Some lords saw it as overreach, others as necessary order. But be those who grumbled obeyed, for to defy the curfew was to risk fine, punishment, or the anger of neighbors should fire strike. The bell was stronger than complaint, its weight not easily ignored. In villages where towers stood on hills, the curfew bell could be heard for miles. Its tone mingled with the lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through fields, the last cries of birds. Became part of the rhythm of life, as expected as sunrise, as constant as seasons. Farmers measured their days by it, knowing when to return from fields. Craftsmen relied on it to end their work lest candles be wasted. Its toll was the metronome of community, steady, enduring, unchanging. Legends formed around certain bells, Some were said to ring on their own in times of danger, warning of fire or attack. Others were believed to carry prayers heavenward more swiftly, their sound sanctified by saints. Children whispered that demons fled at its toll, unable to withstand iron's voice. Whether believed or not, such tales gave the curfew bell a presence beyond its metal form, turning it into a guardian of night. The memory of the bell lingered even when silence returned. Its vibrations seemed to hang in the air, in rafters, in bones. Families lying on straw beds could still hear its echo as they drifted into sleep. For travelers who passed through, the sound was strange, commanding. For townsfolk, it was home, a note as familiar as the voice of kin. To be away from one's town was to miss the bell, to lie uneasily until some other sound took its place. Thus, the curfew bell was more than a signal. It was the heartbeat of community, the voice of caution, the breath that drew all within their walls. It turned night from chaos into order, from danger into discipline. In its slow tolling, people found not only warning but also comfort, the knowledge that all around them were doing the same, that they were not alone in darkness. And when the last note faded, the town exhaled, and the night truly began. Once the curfew bell faded, the world outside grew hushed. But inside, houses filled with their own softer life. A medieval household at night was neither wholly silent nor wholly still. It was a place of small sounds and close company, of firelight dimmed and voices low. Behind shuttered windows, families gathered as darkness folded over roof and wall, and the rhythms of day gave way to the gentler pace of night. The hearth remained the heart. Its flames were banked with ash, but a glow lingered, embers pulsing like the last heartbeat of day. Around it, children sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes heavy yet still hungry for stories. Mothers rocked infants, their lullabies weaving with the crackle of wood. Fathers mended tools by the last light, sharpening a blade, tying a broken strap, their hands practiced in working by touch as much as by sight. The warmth bound them together, keeping out the chill that seeped in through cracks and under doors. Meals, if not finished at sunset, carried into the night. Pottage thickened in the pot, bread torn and dipped, broth ladled into wooden bowls. Meat was rare and often salted, but its scent filled the room, mingling with that of herbs drying in bunches by the beams. Ale was poured sparingly, its bitter taste warming the throat. Supper was simpler than dinner, but it was a tithe of presence. All gathered, none absent, each taking what the day had yielded. When food was done, talk began. Stories of saints and heroes, tales of travelers and beasts, family lore told again so children might remember. Proverbs fell like embers, small and glowing with wisdom. Jests lightened heavy hearts, and laughter rose softly, careful what to break the night's spell. Sometimes silence was chosen instead, each soul content to sit with thought, with prayer, with the simple comfort of nearness. For in a world without endless light, conversation was not endless either. It followed the rhythm of flame, brightening, then fading, then glowing still in memory. Work did not wholly cease. Women spun wool or flax, their spindles whirring faintly, their fingers moving by habit more than sight. Men repaired harness or net, smoothed wood, patched shoes. Children learned letters scratched onto wax tablets, tracing them with care in dim light. These were quieter labors, suited to the hour, done by hand while voices filled the room. The household was both workshop and school, even by night. Bedtime came early for most. Straw mattresses lay in corners, covered by woolen blankets and cloaks. In small homes, all slept in one room, parents and children together, warmth shared as much by body as by fire. In larger homes, chambers divided the family, but in them servants often lay nearby, their pallets spread on floors. Privacy was scarce, but nearness bred safety, and comfort was found in the sound of others breathing in the dark. Prayers closed the day. A wooden cross was kissed, a verse murmured, the sign of the cross made over bed or child. Parents taught their children to commend themselves to God's keeping, to name saints as guardians of their sleep. Death was never far in medieval life, and each night's rest was taken as a gift, uncertain if another dawn would follow. Faith was woven into slumber as tightly as into waking, binding night to heaven's watch. Candles were extinguished one by one. Smoke curled upward, sharp and sweet, lingering in rafters. Embers glowed under their blanket of ash, waiting for morning. The room sank into dark, yet not wholly. Moonlight sometimes found cracks in shutters, silvering beams and floor. Children whispered until sleep carried them. Parents lay still, and silence thickened like another blanket. Yet even in sleep the household stirred. Infants woke, their cries muffled by mother's arms. Dogs growled faintly at sounds outside, then settled again. A man turned in his bed, straw rustling, dreams pressing upon him. Sleep was not a single block, but a rhythm, broken and returned to, as natural as breath. Night was not empty, it was full of small movements, each unseen by day, each part of the hidden life of the home. Thus the household at night was a world apart, quiet yet alive, dim yet rich. It was the place where labor gave way to story, where food gave way to rest, where fear gave way to prayer. It was not the silence of loneliness, but the closeness of family, a silence woven with whispers and breaths. And in that closeness, medieval men and women found the strength to face the dark beyond their doors. Night was not one long stretch of rest in the Middle Ages. It came in halves, like the day itself, divided into what folk called the first sleep and the second. Between them lay a quiet waking, a time when darkness was deepest, when silence pressed most closely on roof and field, and when thoughts wandered freely. To understand medieval night, one must learn this rhythm, for it shaped how men and women knew both their bodies and their souls. The first sleep began soon after supper, when the curfew bell had long since sounded and shutters were drawn. Beds were simple, straw mattresses, woolen blankets, cloaks heaped together, but the weariness of day made them sufficient. Sleep came quickly, heavy and deep, as muscles relaxed from toil and bellies warmed from broth and ale. Children sank at once, their breathing even, their dreams bright with games and tales. Adults followed, grateful for the dark that gave their bodies to rest. This first sleep lasted until midnight or a little after, when eyes opened again almost as if called. The waking between was not strange, but expected. Men stirred, women rose, children whispered. In households, this tie was used in many ways. Some rose to stoke the fire, ensuring warmth for the second half of night. Others prayed, reciting psalms or the Paternoster, believing that midnight was a holy hour when heaven's ear leaned close. Couples turned to one another, the privacy of darkness allowing for tenderness rarely spoken by day. Farmers might check animals, healers might tend to the sick, bakers might begin their work kneading dough by lamplight. The waking hour was quiet but not idle. Dreams, too, were shaped by this pattern. The first sleep often brought heavy dreams, thick with the residue of supper, labor, and the body's fatigue. The second sleep was lighter, its dreams stranger, touched by the prayers, thoughts, or labors done in the midnight waking. Folk spoke of visions seen in those later hours, of messages from saints, of omens or warnings. To dream between the sleeps was to dream on the threshold between earth and heaven, between body's weariness and spirit's watchfulness. Not everyone returned to bed at once. Some lingered in talk, voices low around the embers, sharing secrets too delicate for daylight. Children, half awake, listened to tales their elders told in whispers. Neighbors sometimes visited, slipping across dark lanes with lanterns, sharing news or tending to matters that could not wait. The world at midnight was smaller, closer, yet more open to mystery. Time seemed to stretch differently then, as if the hours between sleeps belonged to another realm. Monasteries marked this rhythm with precision. Bells rang for matins at midnight, calling monks from their cells into choir. Wrapped in cloaks, they shuffled through dark cloisters, their breath clouding in the cold. Candles flickered as psalms were chanted, voices rising and falling in steady cadence. The world beyond was silent, but within the walls prayer filled the night. For monks, the waking between sleeps was what accident but discipline, the heart of devotion, the hour when earth was still and heaven seemed near. The second sleep followed naturally. After prayers, talk, or tasks, beds welcomed bodies again. This rest was lighter, more fragile, as dawn drew nearer. Birds sometimes began to stir before it ended, their calls threading into dreams. Farmers might rise early before the rest to set out for fields. Children, harder to rouse, turned in their blankets until the light grew insistent. Yet the second sleep was as needed as the first, its gentler rest completing the cycle. Without it, the day ahead felt raw and unfinished. This rhythm, so natural to them, has been lost to many in later times. Yet in the medieval world it shaped how people thought of night, not as one long silence, but as two acts with an interlude between. It gave them day for prayer, for love, for reflection, for work too urgent to wait for dawn. It made the night not only a time of rest, but also a time of life, secret and hidden, set apart from the clamor of day. The two sleeps taught a kind of balance. Day held labor and noise, night held rest and silence, but also pause and watchfulness. To live in such rhythm was to accept that life itself was divided between toil and prayer, between body and soul, between fear and trust. Night mirrored that division, and in its two halves, men and women found a pattern that sustained them. Thus the medieval night was not empty. Between its sleeps lay hours rich with presence. The crackle of fire renewed, the murmur of prayers, the whisper of lovers, the chant of monks, the sigh of beasts in stalls. These hours gave shape to dreams and strength to days. And when dawn finally broke, it found people not simply waking, but rising from a night fully lived, half in shadow, half in light. Though shutters closed and families slept, towns and villages were what wholly abandoned to the dark. The night had its guardians, the watch. Their task was simple in word but heavy in duty, to keep order when others rested, to walk lanes when others dreamed, to stand between community and the dangers that prowled unseen. They were the eyes and ears of the sleeping town, their steps slow and steady, their lanterns small stars bobbing against the vast black. The watch was often made of ordinary men. In some towns they were hired, paid by guild or council. In others, duty rotated among citizens, each household sending one when summoned. Armed with staves, bills, or spears, they wore cloaks against the cold, caps pulled low, belts hung with keys to gates and horns for alarm. A lantern swung from a hook, its glow spilling in circles, revealing cobbles slick with dew, doorways shadowed and still. Their walk was measured, their pace patient, their eyes ever moving. They guarded first against fire. More feared than thief or outlaw, fire was the enemy that could devour a street before dawn. Watchmen sniffed the air, listened for the crackle of thatch, looked for glow where none should be. If sparks were found, they roused household with heavy knocks, shouting until water buckets were fetched, until neighbors rushed with cloaks to smother flames. The curfew bell had commanded hearths be banked, but the watch ensured the command was kept. In this way, Their nightly rounds preserved whole towns from ruin. Theft, too, was their concern. Shadows hid men with quick hands and quicker feet, waiting for purses left too near windows, for barns left unbarred, for travelers unlucky enough to be abroad. Watchmen challenged such figures with loud voices, demanding names and business. Some carried whistles or rattles to summon aid, others blew horns whose blasts echoed through empty streets. Thieves fled more often than they fought, for discovery meant not only loss of prey, but shame, punishment, even the noose. The watch's presence, more than their weapons, kept crime at bay. Drunkards were a common quarry. Despite the curfew, taverns still let lingerers out late. Their songs slurred, their steps unsteady. Watchmen guided some home with stern words, carried others to cells where straw and stone sobered them by morning. Too much noise or brawling risked fine, for peace was prized at night as highly as safety. The watch enforced not only law but silence, ensuring that families might sleep undisturbed. In walled towns, gates were locked at curfew, but watchmen still patrolled the walls. They walked parapets, peering into darkness, listening for hoofbeats or strange cries. Torches sputtered in sconces, their flames beaten by wind, casting tall, wavering shadows across battlements. The sound of boots on stone, steady and rhythmic, was comfort to those who lay below. The wall watch was first to see enemies, raiders, or fire beyond fields, their horns the alarm that summoned men to arms. Smaller villages lacked walls, but even there a watch might be set. Young men took turns walking lanes, listening for wolves, for cattle loose, for strangers. Shepherds watched fields, their dogs pricking ears at rustle and howl. Though less formal than in cities, these rural watches mattered no less, for night was thick with dangers where no lamp or bell could be seen for miles. Not all feared the watch. Lovers slipping through streets knew they risked discovery, yet their whispers sometimes mingled with watchmen's chuckles rather than blows. A midwife summoned at night might be escorted with care, her steps guided by lantern, her calling respected. Priests hurrying to dying beds found the watch parting ways for them. The guardians of night knew that not all who walked after curfew were foes. They judged with eyes sharpened by custom, distinguishing mischief from necessity. The watch themselves found night heavy. Cold crept under cloaks, boredom gnawed as hours dragged. Some muttered prayers to keep fear at bay, others sang softly to themselves. Companions talked to pass ein, their voices hushed, echoing oddly through empty lanes. Sometimes they stamped feet to keep warm, swung lanterns idly, leaned on staves as they waited for hours to pass. Their labor was lonely, yet it bound them to one another, for no one understood the night's weight like those who carried it. So the watch and patrol gave the medieval night its spine. Without them, fear might have ruled, law dissolved, fire and theft unchecked. With them, families slept more securely. knowing that while they dreamed, others kept eyes open. Their lanterns, small against vast darkness, were symbols of order, of vigilance, of care. The town's trust lay in their slow steps, in their ears pricked for sound, in their hands ready to strike or to shield. And though most households never saw them, their presence shaped every night, as vital as hearth or bed. When oaths were not enough, when suspicion lingered and truth seemed clouded by deceit, medieval justice turned to harsher proof. It was not enough to weigh words. God himself must be asked to judge. Thus arose the ordeal, fearful and solemn, where fire and water became instruments of truth, and the fate of souls was placed directly into divine hands. The ordeal began in ritual. The church was its stage, for this was no mere test of strength, but a plea to heaven. The accused fasted beforehand, confessing sins, receiving the Eucharist, purifying body and soul, so that God's judgment might be revealed without hindrance. Priests prayed solemnly, chanting psalms, sprinkling holy water upon tools and witnesses alike, for it was believed that heaven would not fail the innocent nor shield the guilty. And so the ordeal was sanctified, a sacred trial. And there were several forms, each terrible in its own way. The ordeal of hot iron was among the most feared. A bar of iron was placed upon the coals until it glowed red, its heat shimmering in the dim church. The accused stepped forward, hands trembling, sweat upon his brow. Before witnesses and priest, he lifted the iron and carried it 3 measured paces. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, the silence broken only by his gasps. Then the iron was laid down, his hand bound in linen, sealed with the sign of the cross. 3 days later, the wound was unwrapped. If it was healing clean, the verdict was innocence. If it festered or blackened, guilt was declared and punishment fell. The ordeal of boiling water was no gentian. A cauldron was set upon fire, filled until it bubbled and hissed. A stone or ring was cast within, sinking to the depths. The accused, stripped to the waist, plunged his arm in and drew it out. The burn was wrapped, sealed, and judged in the ordeal of iron. For the innocent, it was said, God would protect from harm. For the guilty, the wound would betray. The ordeal of cold water reversed the logic. The accused was bound with cords and lowered into a pool or river. Priests praying aloud and the crowd leaned forward. If the water received him, drawing him beneath, it was seen then, sign of innocence, water, pure and blessed, embracing the guiltless. If he floated, refusing to sink, the water rejected him, marking him guilty. Few forgot the sight of a bound man floundering in the stream, his fate judged not by words but by waves. Women sometimes faced ordeals of a different kind. In cases of suspicion, of theft, of sorcery, of adultery, they might be forced to carry red-hot irons or to walk barefoot across glowing plowshares. Some endured their burns light or quickly healed, taken proof of innocence. Others faltered, their wounds severe, their guilt proclaimed. The community watched with wide eyes, whispering of divine will, their hearts stirred by awe and fear. Always the ordeal was public, crowds the pressing close, silent in the solemn of it. Children clutched their mothers' hands, men crossed themselves, wind whispered prayers. The priest's chant echoed in the vaulted church or across the open yard, mingling with the hiss of steam, the crackle of fire, the rush of water. All felt the weight of the moment, for rare was no steward judgment, no sheriff writ, but God decision made visible. To modern eyes, the ordeal seems cruel, but to the medieval heart it was a kind of mercy, for it placed justice beyond human frailty, beyond deceitful tongues and biased neighbors. If the accused was guilty, God would show it. If innocent, God would shield. Faith made sense of pain, giving wounds meaning, turning burns and bruises into signs of divine truth. Yet ordeals were feared deeply. To be summoned to one was terror enough, for even the innocent dreaded the trial. Men prayed with fervor, wind wept, families fasted, begging heaven for mercy. Some fled rather than face the test, embracing outlawry rather than ordeal. Others resigned themselves, stepping forward with grim courage, their trust placed wholly in God's hand. In time, the church itself began to question. Could one truly bind God to reveal guilt through such means? Were men presuming too much upon divine will? By the 13th century, many ordeals faded, replaced by juries and testimony. But for centuries before, the ordeal remained, its memory etched in scar and story. Villages told of men who carried red iron unscathed, women who plunged arms into boiling cauldrons and emerged unmarked, men who sank stones to prove their innocence. At night, when candles burned low, such tales were told by hearths, children listening wide-eyed, imagining the hiss of water, the glow of iron. They learned that crime and innocence were not only matters of man judgment, but of God, that the sacred and the terrifying walked hand in hand in the pursuit of justice. Thus the ordeal was both horror and hope, a trial of body and soul. Pain itself became evidence, which wounds spoke in place of words, and that all who watched believed they glimpsed heaven hand reaching down into the affairs of men. In the chronicles of crime, men are most often named thieves, bandits, brawlers, murderers. Yet when two stood accused, their lives no less bound by law and punishment. Their crimes were often different, shaped by roles and expectations, but the weight of judgment fell heavily upon them all the same. The most common charge was scolding, women who quarreled too fiercely, who shouted insults in lanes, who spread gossip sharp enough to wound reputation, were branded common scolds. Their voices, it was said, disrupted the peace of village life. Men might brawl with fists or knives, but weapons were words, and those words were feared for their power to stir discord. The punishment was humiliation, the cucking stool or the ducking stool. The cucking stool was a wooden chair, sometimes mounted on wheels, sometimes balanced on a long beam over water. The condemned woman was tied fast, her skirts tucked, Her hair flying, she was paraded through the village, jeered by crowds. At the river edge, the stool was tilted, plunging her into the cold water, dragging her sputtering to the surface, only to be dunked again. Laughter rang, insults flew, children shouted gleefully. The scold, dripping and shivering, endured until the crowd was satisfied. Shame was her punishment, water her scours, silence her expected lesson. Women all face charges of slander. To accuse a neighbor of theft, adultery, or dishonesty without proof was crime, well-led sin. Before the manor court, women stood with heads bowed, their words weighed, their reputation questioned. Fines might be levied, but more often shame was imposed. Hair cut short, a hood of shame placed upon the head, or public confession demanded before altar and parish. For a woman, reputation was fragile, and slander not only wounded others but endangered her own standing in community. Petty theft, too, was common. A loaf of bread taken from a stall, a hen slipped from a coop, a bolt of cloth hidden beneath skirts. Hunger drove men such acts, for women often bore the weight of feeding families when food was scarce, yet courts judged sternly, for theft, however small, threatened survival of. Women caught were fined, set in stocks, or whipped, their shame public, their desperation rarely excused. More fearful still were charges of witchcraft. Though not yet the frenzied hunts of later centuries, suspicion lingered. A cow sickened, a child failed to thrive, a storm ruined crops, whispers rose of a woman curse. Old widows, healers with herbs, midwives who knew too much of birth and death, these were most vulnerable. They were hauled before courts, pressed to confess, forced to endure ordeals. Some were acquitted, fined, punished with harsher fates. Fear clung to them long after, for once named a witch, suspicion never faded. Adultery, too, was judged more harshly upon women than men. A wife accused of straying faced public shame, sometimes paraded through streets in mocking garb, sometimes forced to stand before altar and confess. Men's sins were excused aid folly, women condemned betrayal. Such double standards lay heavy upon them, their lives bound by law more tightly, their honor more fragile. Yet would oft defended themselves with strength. Many scolds shouted back, even e'en they were ducked, refusing silence. Some fought fines, bringing witnesses, swearing innocence with oaths, binding liens any man. Some turned accusations back upon their accusers, exposing hypocrisy. And many endured, their reputation mended in time, their voices never wholly silenced. For the community, crimes of woman carried unease. To punish too harshly risked cruelty. To punish too lightly risked disorder. Gossip and slander spread quickly, shaping judgment before courts spoke. Children watched deed, women were ducked or shamed, learning lessons of speech and silence, of gender and power. The sight of a dripping figure hauled from water, hair plastered, eyes flashing with anger or despair, lingered long in memory. At night, in cottages, wind whispered of such things, warning daughters to guard tongues, to keep peace, to avoid suspicion. Men, too, reflected uneasily, for they knew their own mothers, wives, and daughters might one day face the same. The line between ordinary quarrel and crime was thin, and the weight of law heavy upon those who crossed it. Thus, when crimes and punishments reveal both the strictness and the fragility of medieval law, they show how community feared not only theft or violence, but words, reputation, and the mysterious powers of the body. They remind us that justice was not equal, that women bore shame differently, that law mirrored the prejudices of its age. Yet they also reveal resilience, the strength of women who endured, who resisted, who survived the ducking stool, the stocks, the court judgment, and returned to live, work, and speak again. Not every crime ended with iron or gallows. Many were punished instead by shame public, visible, unforgettable. For in the medieval village, reputation was life itself, and to be mocked, jeered, and humiliated before one's neighbors was a wound, painful lays any lash. Thus the stocks, the pillory, and other engines of disgrace stood ready, waiting at the edge of squares and market greens, their wooden beams weather-bare by sun and rain, their locks polished by ease. The stocks were simple but effective, a heavy frame of wood set low to the ground with wood for ankles. The offender was seated or forced to lie, legs clamped fast, unable to move. Sometimes hands were locked well, leaving him helpless. He might remain there for hours, even days, exposed to sun, rain, and the mockery of all who passed. Children jeered, tossing mud or rotten vegetables. Women wagged fingers, men spat or shouted insults. Laughter echoed, cruel and cutting, while the prisoner would only endure, face reddening with shame. The pillory was harsher still. It stood upright, a wooden frame with huts for head and hands. The condemned was lack in place, body bent forward, unable to move arms or wipe his face. All who passed saw him, for the pillory was placed in the busiest spot of town near the market, beside the church, at the center of the green. There the punishment was not only confinement, but exposure, a spectacle meant to teach. Villagers laughed, mocked, threw filth, pelted with eggs, dung, or stones. The body bore bruises, the spirit bore humiliation, the name bore stain that lingered long. Such punishments were given for lesser crimes, petty theft, cheating in trade, slander, drunkenness, disorder. They were not meant to kill, but to correct, to deter. The memory of the pillory, of standing helpless while neighbors mocked, was lesson enough for many never to offend again, and for the community the sight gave reassurance. The law was visible, the guilty unmasked, justice done for all to see. Other shames were used date well. A woman guilty of scolding or slander might be set upon the cucking stool, tied fast and ducked into water until she gasped and sputtered, the crowd roaring with laughter. Her dripping figure, dragged out and jeered, was warning to all who spoke too freely. Drunkards might be forced to wear ridiculous masks or horns, paraded through streets to mock their folly. Bakers who sold light bread were nailed by the ear to their own doors. The crooked loaf hung about their neck, its sign of deceit. The punishments were theatre, and by the law they turned crime into lesson, guilt into laughter, suffering into entertainment. Markets paused, villages feathered, ale flowing, children wide-eyed, gossip rising. Some felt pity, others relish, but all watched, for none could resist the spectacle of humiliation. Yet beneath the jeers lay seriousness. To be mocked was not only momentary pain, but lasting scar. Reputation once sullied was hard to mend. A man who had stood in stocks might find neighbors less willing to trade, less eager to trust his word in court, less ready to stand ens compurgator. A woman ducked for slander might find her voice forever dismissed, her gossip distrusted even when true. Public shame followed long after the stocks were emptied, echoing in whispers and glances. Still there was room for redemption. Some endured with stoic calm, head held high, refusing to flinch or cry. Neighbors, seeing such strength, sometimes softened, pity rising. A priest might visit, offering prayer, reminding all of forgiveness. In time, a life of honesty and service could mend what shame had broken. Yet the memory of the pillory remained, carved into the imagination, a warning both to the guilty and to all who watched. The place itself carried weight. To pass by empty stocks was to remember those who had sat there, their faces vivid in memory. To see the pillory standing silent was to feel its threat, as if it waited patiently for the next sinner. Even when unused, these devices spoke, their wooden beams heavy with the weight of past disgrace. At night, when the crowd dispersed, the punished released, the square grew silent once more. Yet scraps of food, broken eggs, and muddy footprints lingered, silent testimony of the day, laughter and cruelty. The wooden frames loomed in moonlight, shadows stretched across cobblestones, reminders that law was not only about order, but about spectacle, not only about crime, but about shame. Thus, stocks and pillories served the common face of justice, binding community together through laughter and lesson, through cruelty and correction. They made guilt visible, suffering shared, order restored, not by secrecy, but by spectacle. And in their beams of weather-air wood, villagers saw both fear and reassurance. Fear that they themselves might one day stand there, reassurance that the law remained strong, guarding the fragile peace of daily life. If shame alone would not deter, the medieval world turned to the body itself. Flesh bore the mark of justice, pain carried the memory of crime, and scars stood as lifelong warnings. Corporate punishment was brutal, but it was swift, and in its swiftness lay its purpose: to strike fear into others, to remind all that crime carried weight not only in coin or reputation, but in the very flesh of the offender. The most common was the lash. A thief might be stripped to the waist, tied fast to a post, his arms stretched wide, the whip cracked through the air, its leather cords biting into skin. With each strike, welts rose, blood sometimes flowing, cries echoing against stone or timber. The crowd then, giz or eager, unwatching with pity, others with cruel delight. A number of lashes was set by court or steward, 10, 20, perhaps more. When it ended, the man staggered away, back rocked with pain, spirit rocked with shame, a living warning to all. Branding was harsher still. For repeated thefts or deceit, the hand might be burned with hot iron, leaving a scar that rocked the crime forever. The letter T for thief, sometimes, or a symbol chosen by the court. The iron was heated until it glowed, the smell of burning flesh filling the air as it touched skin. The crowd murmured, some crossing themselves, others turning away. The branded hand betrayed guilt forever after, a stigma impossible to hide. No oath could carry the same weight neath that scar, no protest of innocence erase its mark. Mutilation was the sternest of a vet. A pickpocket might lose his fingers, a slanderer her tongue, a false accuser his ears. The knife fell swift, the wound bandaged roughly, the punishment permanent. Few dared repeat crime after such loss, for the body itself bore witness. And for the community, the sight was unforgettable, an earless face, a tongue-lin mouth, a hand missing its fingers. Justice had not only punished, but transformed, turning the criminal into a walking sign of law. The punishments were not given lightly, for they were irreversible. They were reserved for the stubbornly guilty, the repeatedly offending, or the gravely criminal. Yet when imposed, they carried a weight beyond any fine or oath. The body did not forget, the community did not forget, and the memory of pain and scar lived on long after parchment rolls faded. Publicness was key. The lash was delivered before a watching crowd, the branding iron pressed while neighbors stood nearby, the mutilation done with all theirs to see, for punishment was lesson, and lesson required audience. Children peered from behind skirts, men muttered giddily, women whispered prayers, some watched with satisfaction, seeing justice done, others with sorrow, pitying even the guilty. But all watched, and in watching learned. Yet beneath the severity there lingered unease. Priests warned against cruelty, reminding on that even sinners were souls, that mercy should temper wrath. Some punishments shocked even those accustomed to harshness, leaving scars not only on the punished, but on the hearts of those who witnessed. And so, alongside pain, there was always prayer, prayer that the sinner might repent, that God mercy might heal what man justice had broken. Corporate punishment carried all the mark of authority. To see the steward order lashes, the sheriff command branding, the king justice decree mutilation, was to feel the weight of law. The body of the guilty became the parchment upon which power was written, a living proclamation that the lord or crown ruled not only through coin or word, but through command over flesh itself. At night, when the square emptied and the punished lay nursing wounds, silence fell heavy. The post stood empty, the iron cooling, the knife cleaned and set aside. Yet the memory lingered, the cries, the scars, the smell of fire. In cottages, villagers spoke softly of what they had seen, warning children, shaking heads, reminding one another of the cost of sin. Sleep came slowly, dreams troubled by visions of lash and brand. Thus corporate punishment was both fear and lesson, cruelty and correction. It struck deep into body and spirit, leaving marks that lasted lifetimes. Though harsh, it was believed necessary, for without such severity, law might falter, crime might spread, and peace so fragile might rake. In scars and screams, the medieval village read the message clear. Justice was not gentle, but it was present, and its hand reached even into the very flesh of its people. All punishments, shame, lash, branding were severe, but none carried the final death. Execution was the last and greatest sanction, reserved for the gravest crimes: murder, treason, arson, repeated theft, rebellion. To face the gallows or the axe was to stand not only before the judgment of man, but on the very threshold of eternity. And for the medieval mind, death in punishment was both terror and spectacle, a moment where justice and salvation collided before the eyes of all. The gallows stood often on a hill outside the village or town, stark against the sky, visible from fields and roads. Its beams were dark with weather and age, sometimes with older stains. To see, it was to be reminded daily of the law reach, its wood, a silent warning to all who passed. Children pointed at it, asking questions in hushed tones. Farmers looked toward it when leaving fields at dusk, crossing themselves with unease. When the day of execution came, the crowd gathered early. Market stalls closed, work paused, villagers streamed toward the gallows. Merchants and strangers mingled with peasants and lords, for all were drawn to the spectacle. The condemned was led forth under guard, hands bound, often barefoot, sometimes in a plain shift. A priest walked beside him, murmuring prayers, urging confession, holding a crucifix high. Bells tolled slowly, their sound carrying across the countryside, solemn and heavy. For the condemned, the final walk was burdened with ritual. He might confess aloud, naming sins, asking forgiveness from God and neighbors alike. He might proclaim innocence, though such cries rarely changed his fate. Some went silently, heads bowed, others shouted defiance, cursing their judges, their fate, the crowd itself. The mood varied, but all knew the end was certain. At the gallows, the executioner waited, hooded or barefaced. He was both feared and necessary, a man rocked by his trade. The rope swung in the breeze, coarse and unforgiving. The condemned mounted the ladder or stood upon the cart, priest whispering final prayers. The crowd hushed, breath held, hearts tight. Then the rope was fixed, the signal given, the cart drawn away or the ladder kicked aside. The body dropped, the rope snapped taut, and death came slowly, cruelly. Legs kicked, arms strained, faces contorted. Some died swiftly, others lingered, and the crowd watched in silence, murmuring prayers or gasping at the sight. Hanging was the common fate, But other deaths carried their own horrors. Beheading, reserved for nobles, was quicker, though not always clean. The axe or sword fell, sometimes true, sometimes clumsy, forcing repeated blows. Burning at the stake was punishment for heresy. The flames consuming body and voice together mid smoke rose to heaven. Drowning or burying alive were whispered of in darker tales. Punishments for women condemned of witchcraft or child murder. Each method was chosen with purpose, each designed not only to kill but to teach. The body was not always released to family. Sometimes it was left upon the gallows, swinging in the wind, crows gathering, flesh wasting, bones whitening in the sun. Passers besaw it daily, a give reminder. There hangs the thief, they said, pointing to the empty sockets, the skeletal grin. Fear was kept alive not only in memory but in sight. In other cases, bodies were cut down after a time, buried in unconsecrated ground, denied the rest of churchyard soil. To die by rope was not only to lose life, but to lose honor, burial, and peace. For the crowd, the execution was both horror and reassurance. Horror at the suffering, the cries, the twisting body, reassurance that justice lived, that the peace of the village was defended, that crime bore its cost. Children were warned by parents, remember what you saw, and walk the path of law. Men muttered of fairness or cruelty, wind whispered prayers for mercy, priests reminded all of sin, penance, and salvation. For the condemned, hope lingered even in the final moment. If confession was made, if priestly absolution given, the soul might yet be saved, though the body perished. Many clung to this, confessing at the last, kissing the crucifix, whispering prayers the rope tightened. In the medieval mind, death was punishment but also passage, and to die shriven was a mercy even on the gallows. When the crowd dispersed, silence returned to the hill. The wind stirred the rope, crows circled, shadows lengthened. Villagers walked home more slowly, speaking in hushed tones, their own lives measured against what they had seen. In cottages that night, candles burned lower, prayers longer, sleep troubled by images of swinging rope and final cries. Thus execution stood the ultimate edge of justice. Crime was ended by death. The body and soul parted under the eye of law and God. It was terror, warning, ritual, and lesson all in one, binding community together in the shared witness of justice carried out. Though the gallows wood might rot, though the rope might fray, its memory endured in every villager heart. Crime led dead, and beyond this fight there was no return. Though the gallows and the lash were swift, there were times when justice demanded not death nor blows, but confinement. To be locked away, cut off from fields and family, from light and air, was itself a punishment, a slower, quieter form of suffering. In the medieval world, prisons were not yet the vast institutions of later centuries, but they existed in many forms. Dank cells beneath castles, stone towers above city gates, chambers in town halls, even sheds or barns pressed into service. They were places of waiting, of fear, of despair. For most, prison was not a sentence in itself but a holding place. The accused, once seized by sheriff or steward, was confined until trial. The guilty, once condemned, might be held until execution. But ere were sentenced to long confinement, their crime deemed too vain for fine, yet not deserving of death. For such men and women, the days stretched endlessly, rocked only by the rattle of chains and the faint light filtering through barred slits. Castle dungeons were most feared. Beneath thick walls and heavy towers, narrow stairways led downward into darkness. The air grew damp, the smell rank with mold and waste. Cells were small, sometimes little more than huts carved in stone, with straw for bedding, a bucket for need, iron rings set into walls. Chains clinked and prisoners shifted, their ankles rubbed raw, wrists bruised from manacles. Rats scurried in corners, water dripped steadily, echoing in the gloom. To spend winks here was misery. To spend years was torment beyond imagining. Not on prisons were so give. In towns, chambers above gatehouses or within halls might serve as cells. These were brighter, with windows overlooking streets, and prisoners could sometimes see life continuing beyond their bars, markets bustling, children laying, bells ringing. This sight was its own torment, freedom so close, yet unreachable. Sometimes families passed food through the bars, or friends sought encouragement from below. But always the iron lock, the guard watchful eye, reminded the prisoner of his cage. Life in confinement was harsh, food was coarse, stale bread, thin broth, water drawn from wells, straw grew foul quickly, vermin-infested corners, cold bit deep in winter, heat stifled in summer, guards varied, yet cruel, mocking, quick with staff or boot, others indifferent, doing only their duty. For the prisoner, time blurred, days merging into one another, broken only by bells from churches outside or the occasional visit of priest or kin. Yet within prison walls hope still stirred. Priests came to hear confession, to off the host, to remind prisoners that even chains would not bind the soul. Families brought bread, candles, clothing, small comforts. Some prisoners carved crosses into stone, marks of days or prayers whispered, songs echoed softly, hymns rising faintly in the dark. Faith clung to the last possession. Escape was rare, but dreamed of always. Stories were told of men filing through bars with smuggled tools, of women bribing guards with coins or favors, of ropes lowered from windows by friends outside. Some succeeded, vanishing into forest or town, living thereafter as fugitives. Others failed, caught and punished with harsher chains or with the rope itself. Imprisonment carried shame butchmans, suffering, to be known as one who had lain in chains, who had eaten prison bread, rocked a man reputation. Neighbors whispered, children pointed, trust faltered. Even after release the memory clung like shadow. Yet for some the experience deepened faith, humbled pride, or turned hearts toward repentance. To lie awake in darkness, hearing only one breath in prayers, was to confront the soul directly, with no labor or laughter to distract. For the community, The prison stood bend symbol to walk past the castle tower, and no men were chained within, was both unsettling and reassuring. Unsettling, for the thought of such darkness chilled the heart; reassuring, for it meant justice was vigilant, that criminals were held, that order endured. The very sight of barred windows or iron doors carried weight, warning all of the cost of crime. At night, when villages and towns fell silent, prisons remained restless. Chains clinked, prisoners shifted, voices murmured in dreams or prayer, footsteps of guards echoed on stone. Beyond the walls, owls saw, dogs barked, bells told the hours. Within, time dragged endlessly, rocked only by the sound of keys turning in locks, by the faint hope that one day freedom might return. Thus the prison and the dungeon were more than stone and chain. They were the shadow side of law. Men and women learned the price of crime in silence and confinement. Bodies endured cold and hunger, and wed souls wrestled with despair and hope. Though gallows and lash struck swiftly, the dungeon struck slowly, each day a wound, each night a judgment, each hour a reminder that justice could cage well it kill. In the medieval mind, sin and crime were never far apart. To break the law was to offend not only king or lord, but God himself. Theft, murder, perjury, and adultery were crimes against community, yet also sins against heaven. And as the sins, though hidden from human eyes, were confessed high crimes in the secrecy of the confessional. Thus the Church stood not only as healer of souls, but also as judge of earthly wrongs, its shadow falling across every dispute and punishment. The Church itself offered sanctuary. A fugitive pursued for theft or bloodshed might dash through the churchyard, fling himself against the doors, and clutch the altar with trembling hands. There, under the holy roof, he was safe, for to drag him out by force was sacrilege. The law might circle, the sheriff might fume, but the man at the altar was shielded by God peace. For days, sometimes weeks, he might remain, fed by kin or pitying townsfolk, sleeping by candles, whispering prayers for mercy. But sanctuary was not escape. The law demanded choice, either face trial or confess and accept exile. Some fugitives admitted guilt, abjured the realm, and were led barefoot to the edge of kingdom, staff in, never to return. Others lingered until hunger or despair drove them out. Facing court at last, sanctuary gave pause, not pardon. It was mercy enough to prevent immediate death, but not always enough to save. Ecclesiastic courts judged matters of the spirit, yet their reach was wide. Clergy accused of crime were tried not in secular courts, but before bishops. Students at universities claimed benefit of clergy, their learning granting them the same privilege. For many, this meant lighter sentences, penance, fines, loss of office, but rarely lash or gallows. To common folk, this seemed unfair. Why should an unseared head or a scholar cap shield from rope? Murmurs of resentment grew, yet the system endured, for the church authority was vast. The church or judge sins not named crimes by kings, adultery, incest, usury, heresy, all fell under ecclesiastic law. Accused men and women stood before bishops or archdeacons, confessing failings of flesh or conscience. Punishments were often penances, fasting, pilgrimage, prayers repeated by the hundreds, sometimes public confession in church. For the soul was thought more precious than the body, and correction more valuable than pain. Yet shade weighed heavily, and the memory of standing exposed before one parish stunned for years. Confession itself blurred the line between sin and crime. A man might kneel before priest, whispering theft, assault, even murder. The seal of confession bound the priest to silence. He could not reveal what he heard, even to save a life. Yet penance could be imposed, restitution required, journeys of pilgrimage demanded. Thus many crimes were addressed in secret, shaped into spiritual correction rather than public punishment. Whether this brought true justice was debated even then, but the sanctity of confession remained inviolate. Sometimes church and town clashed. A murderer fled to sanctuary. The sheriff demanded his surrender. The bishop insisted on mercy. A priest accused of theft was claimed by ecclesiastic court, while villagers demanded he face the pillory like any other. Heretics condemned by bishops were handed to secular powers for execution. The church itself, unwilling to shed blood yet complicit in death. The boundaries wavered, negotiated case by case, the balance between mercy and severity shifting like shadow across stone. For villagers, the church role was both comfort and confusion. They saw neighbors spared gallows by benefit of clergy, yet they also saw sinners shamed upon altars. They believed sanctuary holy, yet they feared criminals slipping free. They confessed sins great and small, whispering what could not be spoken in courts, yet they lived under sheriffs who punished openly and harshly. The dual weight of law, earthly and heavenly, pressed upon them always, sometimes at odds, sometimes entwined. Still, the church offered something secular justice could not, hope of redemption. Where the sheriff broke rope, the priest broke penance. Where the gallows ended life, the altar promised forgiveness. Even those condemned to die found solace in last confession, believing their souls cleansed though their bodies swung. The church softened justice, even as it sometimes sharpened it, ensuring that sin was never only crime, and crime never only sin. At dusk, when bells tolled for vespers, villagers reflected on both laws. They remembered the stocks, the lash, the gallows. They remembered, too, the altar, the confessional, the whispered absolution. Between fear and hope, shame and mercy, their lives unfolded, bound by both crown and church. Thus crime and sin, justice and penance, gallows and altar stood side by side, two faces of one order. To live in the medieval world was to walk always between them, fearing punishment yet hoping for forgiveness, trembling before law yet trusting in grace. In that tension, fragile and enduring, the soul and the body alike were held to account. Law was not only lived in courts and punishments, it was also told in stories, sung in ballads, whispered by hearths, for in the medieval world, Tales carried justice into imagination, shaping how villagers thought of crime, punishment, and the thin line between outlaw and hero. Ballads of outlaws filled taverns and fairs. Minstrels sang of men who dwelt in the greenwood, robbing rich travelers, sharing spoils with the poor, outwitting sheriffs and lords. Their names were men, some true, uninvented, some blurred by memory. The most famous, Robin Hood, was sung of long before his tales were written, a figure of defiance against harsh law, a thief yet a giver, a sinner yet a kind of saint in March mind. Children clapped at his clever tricks, men nodded dimly, women smiled at his mercy. Whether he truly lived mattered little. The legend carried hope that justice might be more than lash and rope. Other stories warned rather than inspired. Tales of bandits caught and hanged, their bodies left to rot on gallows hills. Stories of Lyle exposed, their perjury punished by festering wounds. Legends of witches burned by fire, their curses extinguished in smoke. Such stories chilled hearts, teaching that crime would not escape divine or earthly justice. Mothers hushed children with them, neighbors reminded one another, priests wove them into sermons. Stories traveled farther than courts. A punishment seen in one town became pale in another, embroidered and repeated until truth and invention merged. In such a place, people said, a thief ear was nailed to the church door. In such a market, a false baker was dragged through the streets with stones in his bread. Memory became myth, myth became warning, and warnings lived longer than parchment rolls. Even saints' lives carried lessons of justice, stories told of holy men who judged disputes with wisdom, of miracles revealing guilt, of sinners forgiven and transformed. These tales blended law with faith, reminding all that true justice belonged to God, that even the guilty might be redeemed. At night, when work was done and families sat by the fire, stories of crime and punishment passed from mouth to ear, shaping children's fears and hopes. They learned that theft brought stocks, lies brought shame, murder wrote rope. Yet they also learned that cleverness might outwit cruelty, that mercy might triumph, that the poor might be defended against the strong. Thus legend softened the harshness of law, weaving imagination into the stern fabric of justice. Crime was not only a fact of life, but a story told, sung, and remembered. In tales, justice could be cruel, but it could also be kind. Though Gallows stood give upon the hill, the songs of greenwood heroes and cautionary tales carried law into dreams. We punishment and hope walked side by side. The tale of crime and punishment in the medieval world is not only a tale of cruelty and fear, it is also a tale of balance, of two forces bound together, shadow and light, justice and mercy. For though the stocks and gallows loomed, though dungeons were dark and ordeals cruel, still there remained the hope of pardon, of forgiveness, of grace. The medieval soul lived always between these two, dreading the weight of law, and trusting that mercy might soften its hand. Justice was stern, it demanded order, for without order the fragile life of the village could not endure. To steal was to threaten hunger, to fight was to endanger peace, to kill was to tear the fabric of community itself. Law responded harshly, to mend what was broken, to warn others, to bind men and women together again in the shadow of consequence. The steward fines, the sheriff Gallows, the king justice, they were heavy, but they gave shape to life, a boundary within which work and worship could continue. Yet mercy was never absent. Lords would pardon, priests could absolve, kings could grant reprieve. A thief who stole out of hunger might be spared death, fined instead, or sent on pilgrimage. A murderer confessing with tears might be shriven before rope claimed him, soul saved though body lost. Villages themselves could forgive, neighbors agreeing to set quarrels with handshake and oath rather than blows. Even the stocks, cruel though they seemed, were less than death, leaving room for repentance and return. Mercy flowed most strongly through the church. In confession, sins were forgiven, penances given not to destroy but to heal. Pilgrimage turned crime into devotion, fasting into cleansing, prayer into restoration. At the altar, the sinner knelt side by side with the honest man, both receiving the same host, both bound by the same hope of grace. And when death approached, even for the condemned, priests whispered absolution, reminding all that God's mercy was greater than man law. This tension shaped medieval life. Villagers feared the sheriff, but they also trusted the priest. They dreaded the gallows, yet they prayed for pardon. They told children of stocks and whips, but also of saints' mercy, of Christ forgiving thieves upon the cross. Justice guarded the community, mercy guarded the soul. Both were needed, both were true. At times the balance tipped too far toward cruelty. Innocents suffered false oaths, harsh sheriffs, unjust lords, crowds jeered with glee, men were beaten for getting pity, bodies hung too long upon gallows, dungeons grew too full, ordeals scar those undeserving. These shadows cannot be denied, yet always within them voices tall for compassion, priests pleading for clemency, neighbors speaking in defense, rulers granting pardon to hoe their generosity. Mercy, though sometimes faint, endured. In the quiet of evening, when punishments were done and crowds dispersed, villagers returned to hearths, reflecting on what they had seen. They whispered to children, "Do steal, do lie, do fight," warning of pain and shame. Yet they also whispered prayers, "God forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." Between warning and prayer, fear and hope, they lived. Thus, crime and punishment in the medieval world was not only about stocks and gallows, but about the constant weaving of law and grace. Justice stood to protect the fragile peace of community. Mercy stood to remind that even the guilty were souls beloved still of God. Together they shaped life, harsh the winter winds, gentle spring rain. So the story ends not at the gallows nor in the dungeon, but in the quiet hope that mercy might prevail, that forgiveness might wall punishment, that compassion might soften cruelty, that even in the stern face of justice the smile of grace might be glimpsed. For the medieval world, harsh though it was, held always to this truth: justice may guard, but mercy redeems.